Hello, puppies and kittens. I am talking with Dr. Dennis McDonald, professor of religion, particularly New Testament and Christian origins at Claremont School of Theology. Thank you for being on, sir. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah.
So, you have a PhD from Harvard and a Master of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary, and you're best known for proposing the idea that some portions of the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, were written following the storytelling techniques of Homer's Odyssey, the Iliad, and other works of popular fiction, as I understand it. So, are you then saying that the Gospels are largely, if not entirely, fictitious?
They are historical fictions, yes.
Help me
That
if you
is,
would help me flesh out what that means.
the historical part is that many of the characters in the Gospels were historical people. Jesus, we know of the names of Peter, James, and John. From Pauline literature, we have the Acts of the Apostles, which has some historical characters that reappear or appeared earlier, actually, in the Acts of the Apostles, and so on. But these characters become these historical characters become characters in mythologies, especially Jesus, in a way of establishing a new social identity for the Christian community inside of the larger Greco-Roman mythological framework. And so these are historical characters. I'm not a mythicist, I'm a historicist. In fact, I also am a scholar on the Q document and the historical Jesus. But these stories surely are mythologized. Now, many people have understood that they're mythologized, but they don't see them as related to Greek poetry. They think that they're somehow in the flow of oral mythologies in ancient societies, or they were flawed memories of Christians who were trying to idealize Jesus as one who can walk on water, visit the dead, and rise from the dead. But actually, these stories are much more sophisticated than that. They have their origins in Greek poetry, and these authors know what they're doing. They're not trying to tell historical tales. They're trying to tell alternative mythologies that allow their community to find its identity inside of the Greco-Roman world, which is so dominated by Greek poetry.
Are we talking about something along the lines of when George Washington cut down the cherry tree?
We are, except then I'd want to know if there were an analogy to that in literature earlier on. And I don't see that there is. So it would be more like the generic qualities of storytelling about heroes and integrity and so on, as opposed to mimesis, which would be then the imitation of a particular literary achievement.
I want to just talk to you about your perspective regarding Jesus' mythicism. I know that there are a number of scholars who say that Moses is not a historic character,
Yeah.
that he never existed as described, and that he is instead a composite of a few different real and fictional characters. But historians typically hold that Jesus was a real person in history, even though he's technically not in history himself, and that we know that the whole of the Jesus legend cannot be attributed all to a single person. That at least some of the Jesus story comes from other sources, like a compilation of real and fictional characters, or parts of his story appear to be tropes inspired by earlier stories of Prometheus, Dionysus, or John the Baptist, and so on.
Well, we have similar stories about Alexander the Great. No one doubts that Alexander the Great was a historical character. But from that early death of Alexander, one gets a dramatic mythologizing of the story in the life of Alexander and so on. So historical characters get mythologized all the time. And I go back to what you said about George Washington. No one doubts that George Washington existed, but we know that there's a mythology that surrounds him. The same thing's true, by the way, of Elvis Presley or Martin King or this is sometimes called fan fiction. And I think that's a fair way of understanding it. The fan is a fan of a historical person. Let's say Michael Jackson. On the other hand, the mythologies that emerge around through fan fiction can be really quite outrageous, and some of them are kind of in the air. But I wouldn't be surprised that some of them have literary connections. And what mimesis criticism attempts to do is to have a more disciplined understanding about mythological similarities, so that we can actually draw a line between one text to another, the same way we would with Virgil's Aeneid in drawing a line to the Homeric epics, where Virgil is rewriting the epics in order to valorize a new social identity of the Roman Empire under Augustus. So that's what distinguishes mimesis criticism from mythicism. Mythicists would argue there's no historical Jesus. I think the evidence is so overwhelming that I really don't understand how mythicists can get away with have any intellectual integrity. I put it this way other time. I think mythicism is intellectually bankrupt and really quite unnecessary. So Jesus was mythologized, but it doesn't mean Jesus was a myth.
Okay, well, myself personally, I put Jesus into the same category as Robin Hood, King Arthur, and Dracula, in that there is a popular expectation that there's some historic basis in fact. But even if there was, what there was has been grossly contorted almost beyond recognition. And I think if we had a time machine and maybe an Aramaic speaking guide, that we wouldn't be able to find one and only one individual at the heart of all of the Jesus legends that are, at least those that are now considered canon. And I think that if we did find one man who was clearly the source of most of that what one guy could recognize as, or what we would recognize as Jesus, then I think that just if we were to find the historic root of Robin Hood.
Okay, all right. Okay, you know that I'm going to disagree with you, right? And that's
I
fair enough.
don't. So that's
no. But what do you do with Q? Do you hold to a Q hypothesis for the Gospels?
Okay. So my thought is if we brought Robin Hood forward in time, then he wouldn't recognize himself, and he wouldn't know who Maid Marian is, for example. And so I have the suspicion that if we brought Jesus forward in time, that he wouldn't recognize Christianity.
Well, I agree with that.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. That is, the Christ of the Christian church is not the historical Jesus, and he'd be astonished that his reputation was that. In that respect, I agree with you.
Okay, yeah. You had me worried there for a minute.
Well, I think the big issue I have with mythicists, and I'm not going to say you need to respond to this one way or the other, but is the minimizing the importance of a search for the Q document, because the Q document is not mythologized by Homer and so on, the same way that the Gospels, the canonical Gospels are, at least. And that's our earliest narrative presentation of Jesus, because Paul is earlier, but he doesn't give a narrative presentation. The other is that I have a different interpretation of passages in Josephus about Jesus. And this isn't the time to talk about that, I'm sure, because that gets really very technical. But
I'd be interested in that, because I read Robert Price describing Josephus as by his Jewish name, Joseph Bar Matthias, which he says it could that possibly have been Joseph of Arimathea mistranslated. And then the way that he writes about what Josephus said about his three friends that he found on the cross, and he goes to Titus to get them cut down. And I think, two of them lived, but one died. And the account that he gives, it looks like they're telling us that Luke the author of Luke and Josephus are both telling the same story from either side of the field, which I thought was an interesting interpretation.
Okay, it's an interesting interpretation, and it's all crap. I mean, how do you explain the other literature on the Josephus's life, on the Bellum, and not just the Antiquitates? So yes, there are passages that seem to be interpolations or mythologizing in Josephus. There's no doubt about that. But to think that Joseph of Arimathea is somehow Josephus, I mean, he's smoking weed, my friend.
Well, probably the less said about that source, the better. That was just one argument that he made that I thought was interesting. So I like to see that bounced off of other scholars and see how they respond to that. So thank you for that. Regarding the Jesus thing, I'm perfectly comfortable with the position that I've always held, which was that the man most at the heart of this, because we know certain stories were added on that were never actually part of his life, so that we're not even looking for a historical basis there.
Sure.
But the man, if there is one man at the center of most of that most of us would agree with, okay, this guy was Jesus. Again, if we had that time machine, you can go find him. How he was apparently a first century faith healer and exorcist, which I think is not significantly different than the faith healers and self-proclaimed exorcists that we still have on TV today. I see the same kind of guy who's was asking for the donations allegedly to feed the poor, and these donations likely aren't even making it to the poor. That would be that would be my suspicion of what sort of person Jesus would be if we could find him.
Well, I think there are two things to say, Aaron, about that. One is that we shouldn't think that Jewish society does not have many exorcists that are going around, or people that play the role of healers. So that early Christians understood Jesus's charisma to include that should not come as a surprise to us. And that can be, those can be attributed to real human beings, as they were in Judaism, and in the Greco-Roman world generally. But the other is that the information that we have that makes Jesus a healer and an exorcist first appears as narrative in the Q document. But the Q document also is not writing a historical text. It's portraying Jesus as the promised prophet like Moses, and to do so, it rewrites Deuteronomy. So the prophet who's coming like Moses is going to be a miracle worker the way Moses was. As Moses performed the miracles of the Exodus, so the new Moses is going to be able to perform miracles like that. So in the Q document, when John asks, the disciples of John ask Jesus, "Are you the one to come?" he lists some miracles that he's done. Now, I don't believe in miracles. That's not to mean that I can't make sense. I mean, that science makes sense of everything, but I don't believe in miracles. I think this is a part of the propaganda of early Christians to exalt the position of Jesus. But that doesn't deny his historicity. It just simply says that he was a character to whom was attributed the ability to do remarkable things. Now, whether the historical Jesus did them or not, I'm not in a position to say, but if he did, it's because that was an expectation in a culture that's different from ours.
With so much of the stories about Jesus, I've heard that when, like the fruit or the fig tree bit, for example, one person will tell me that that's evidence of failure, and so it indicates that Jesus was really there. And then somebody else will tell me, but the whole story is just metaphorical and didn't really happen. They're just telling the story in order to impart the cherry tree thing yet again.
There's a good Homeric answer to that. Odysseus, when he goes into the city of the Phaeacians, is amazed at the garden of Alcinous, because it has fruit trees that bear in and out of season. And Jesus comes and sees a fig tree just outside the temple, which is similar in location to what happens in Odyssey, Book 7. That is, Odysseus is at the palace of Alcinous, and he sees his garden, and he has fruit that bears in and out of season. So the fig tree becomes a metaphor for the temple, and Jesus curses the fig tree because it's not like the fig tree of Alcinous that bears fruit after fruit. And by the way, the word is suke, the same word in Mark that appears in the Odyssey and it's fig after fig. I think it's suke episukin or something like that, but it's the same word, and it's in the context. That's surely what it is. That the entry of Jesus is a mythology. He enters into Jerusalem and looks around, he curses the fig tree and so on. That's what happens in the Odyssey in Book 7.
You translated the Bible yourself, didn't you?
Well, I translate Homer and Euripides and Virgil, everything that appears in my book, synopses of epic and the tragedies and the Gospels. I translate, and so I've translated everything in the Gospels and most of the things in the Acts of the Apostles as a part of my career, but they appear in the book synopses of epic tragedy and the Gospels.
Yeah. Well, my final question was just this: when I heard that you had personally translated the Bible, the entirety of it, I was just wondering what was the most significant differences between your translation and the King James or NIV or other popular translations.
I've only translated all of the New Testament and a lot of Christian Apocrypha, but not certainly, I'm no longer capable of translating Hebrew well. I used to be, I guess. I think the biggest difference is that I'm more interested in accuracy than I am in beauty. And I'm more interested in the potential parallels that are there with Greek poetry, so that without trying to distort the text, if I have a choice of wording, I'm going to probably choose one that is somewhat similar to what one would find in Greek poetry, but I have to discipline myself so that doesn't become. So in most cases, my translations of the New Testament are very close to what you'd find, let's say, in the Revised Standard Version.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, because we do these Bible studies. We'd like to know that there hasn't been something glaringly wrong from your personal perspective.
There are occasionally I choose textual variants that seem to be closer to poetry, but yeah.
Understood. All right, so the reason we're having this chat is because we want to promote the synopsis of Epic Tragedy of the Gospels. This is a course that you're doing on how you do the mimesis.
Yeah.
And I understand you're going to be going in depth, because I wanted to ask all these questions about show me Homer's Odyssey, or show me the Iliad in the Gospels and so on. Can you tell me just a moment about that, and we'll wrap it up?
Well, Derek and I decided that what we would do after the first introductory session is to focus just on one story at a time. And the way we usually do it is that I would give a narration of a story from Greek poetry, mostly from Homer, but also from Euripides and one time from Sophocles. And then we'd have the gospel story, and then we would talk about the similarities and differences between the stories, and apply the criteria of mimesis criticism to determine the likelihood that there may be some genetic connection between the two. Very so we do it story by story.
Outstanding. Thank you very much for being on, sir.
Nice to meet you. All the best.